Hi there and welcome to Central Texas Gardener. I'm Tom Spencer. One of the best things about summer is the herbs we can grow. Many are full-time residents, but others like Basil wait for their annual chance at the heat. Today, Cindy Phillips from the Austin Herb Society shows what we can plant even in containers and how to get the most out of their flavor. On tour, we visit a family that turned their front yard into the neighborhood playground and bistro.
This Green Garden Award winner actually begins in the front yard. Since 2005, when Cordy and Paul Mair moved in with their family, they've turned the front yard into the neighborhood bistro and playground.
It was a desert. We had 3 trees and just grass, that was all. And it was very plain, very boring, and incredibly large. And in front of the house, there were these great big photinias that must have been 7 feet tall, and they were right up against the house and blocked all the sun. And then there were some purple sages, and my husband Paul, they weren't doing very well, and so he got his truck, put a chain around him, and just yanked him out.
With a Ford Explorer.
I thought he was crazy when he told me he was going to do that, but it worked really well.
The neighbors were like, "Yeah, Paul."
I wanted a social space that would be a place where we could sit and enjoy the sunset, have some privacy, but yet we have a little boy and we wanted to be able to see him as he played on the street with the other kids, because this is a cul-de-sac, and yet not be on display. So we planned this patio with bushes and trees around it that provided privacy but also had view spaces.
We wanted to do a different entryway. There was just a sidewalk that was done with concrete. So I wanted to look out the house and have the fountain in front of us, and then go through the trees and go out and redirect the sidewalk, so you actually walk through the space.
And it's really great that we can sit out here, have a glass of wine, have dinner, have coffee, and see our neighbors and wave at them.
And the neighbors come over quite often and join us.
It's made for a real good social environment on the street. I knew that I wanted a real defined structure to the garden, and that's why we have the vertical lines and height. But then I wanted the agaves and the sharpness and the gray, and then some softness to soften it all out. I like the grays and whites because in the summer it's cooling to look at. But yet we didn't want to give up color. We've also tried to incorporate things that will bloom by the seasons. So we're going for coolness and low water use and easy maintenance. And then I'm a plant person. I like one of this, one of that. And I had talked with a local designer here in town, Nancy Weber, and she really stressed to me that with a big house, you needed to have several plantings of the same.
Nancy was very helpful to encourage us to make the beds big and wide and connect them all. So Sherry had a great time going through her books and finding all kinds of the different vegetation and plants for the garden, and we haven't stopped yet. We're still. I still come home and there's another 20 plants. It's like, Sherry, you got to stop.
Well, that's probably not going to happen as long as Sherry owns a shovel.
Some plants work well where I put them the first time, but then I keep telling Paul, gardening is you have to find the right place for your plant, and you do the best you can the first time, but it may not work out, and so you move it. Like I have agaves, you would think the toughest, hardest plants around, and there are certain areas in the garden that they don't like it. It's too much water, not enough drainage, and so they've died there. And where I've been able to rescue them and move them to a less friendly or a drier environment anyway.
When I first came to the United States, I lived in a very suburban neighborhood, and it was all St. Augustine and very few plants. So, you know, coming from Germany with such a rich vegetation we've had, and it took me a while to discover this here and establish that a richness in landscaping. When I look at pictures from the spring, from last year and this year, it's completely different. And whatever is today is going to be totally different next year again. Just the richness, the fullness that we actually have whole walls that are green now, and we don't just look at a fence that is a cedar fencing, but it is a lot of vegetation on it, and it's every day, I mean, changing and pretty to look at.
Some of the other neighbors have started to also take up their front yards and take up the grass, put things at the median, and so we're going to start a garden club, and we're going to focus on xeriscape, low water use, design, adaptive plants. I really encourage people to do more gardening in the front yard, to make a social space where they can feel comfortable, so that they can get to meet their neighbors, so they can play in the front yard with their kids, or hang out with their friends. And that's made such a change in getting to know people and really using the space that supports the way you want to live.
Thanks for sharing your garden with us. And right now we're going to be talking about herbs for the summertime. That's right, plants that will take the summer heat and also freshen up your kitchen table. I'm joined by Cindy Phillips, who's the co-president of the Austin Herb Society. And Cindy, welcome to Central Texas Gardener.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's a pleasure, of course. And I know that you're a longtime herb gardener. We were just talking about that you've been gardening with herbs for over 20 years. So I know more than a few things about these tough little plants that we're going to be talking about here. And I think that's the first thing that I'd like to start with, is to let people know how easy these are really to garden with.
They're very easy to garden with. They're drought resistant. The deer don't eat them, which is a big plus where I live.
Right.
They repel insects in your garden. They guard your vegetables. They taste good. Every cook should have a few herbs at least.
Right. Well, more than a few. It's so easy to grow them here in Central Texas. Generally speaking, let's talk about how you would prepare a site for herbs. Now, this is the one thing that I think is critical. If you're going to grow herbs, it really does take a prepared site, because they really want good drainage, right?
That's true. They like to be raised up a little bit. They want good drainage. They hate to get their feet wet. And they don't take any particularly rich soil. I've got herbs that grow, they jumped outside my garden and are growing in the caliche. So they're really good candidates for, and they grow well in containers. Almost every herb grows really well in a container, as long as it's well drained and sunny. They like sun.
That's right. Well,
lots of sun.
Those are the key things. I think you've said it all right there. Is the sun and good drainage, and being raised up a little bit, whether that's in the ground or in a container. They're really easy to grow. And and you indicate, they, for the most part, repel pests. I don't really know of any severe problem with pests on any herb.
I don't either. I haven't experienced that.
Yeah.
And they seem to protect my garden vegetables too. I've got sage and lemongrass and rosemary that grow outside of the perimeter, just right outside my fence. My fence that keeps the deer out. Those are the biggest pests for most anything. But deer don't generally like herbs either.
Right, right. They may nibble, but they won't gorge themselves because of the strong flavor, which they don't like. Well, I can't think about herbs in Austin without thinking about the basils, and it's one of the glories of summer. Fresh basils with fresh tomato. There's nothing like it in the whole world, and there are a host of different basils that people can choose from. Now, we have with us a number of different varieties. I'm going to pull these out. We can talk about them couple of different compact forms here. One right here that is a little globe of form. And look how tiny, I want people to see how tiny these are.
This is a really good container plant. It's real pretty. It makes just a little bouquet.
Right. Well, you can see that it would be quite literally a little globe-like form in the garden. And our producer, Linda, says this is one of her all-time favorites. She really loves the flavor of this one. And what would you use this for in your kitchen?
Everything.
Really?
In the summertime, I get so excited by the basils. You can this small leaf variety. You can just pick the leaves off and put it in soup. And the rule with using fresh herbs is to use maybe 2 or 3 times as many herbs, as much as you would dried herbs. And also basil dries very well, and you'll usually get a very big crop of it. So
be prepared to dry some because it will last.
Or if you don't want to do that, just put it in the blender, the leaves, not the stems, and with olive oil or with tomatoes, and blend it up. Put it in the freezer. You can put the olive oil in just in the refrigerator and use it as you will, on tomatoes or
Sounds
with
great.
mozzarella and ripe olives.
Well, I have here a little. It's called purple bush basil, and again, this I think shows kind of the ornamental qualities that a lot of these plants have because it has a really nice bright color to it.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I love things with purple stems and green leaves.
Yeah. And this is one that you could use in the same way that you just described. These are all culinary plants.
Yes, all the basils.
Right. So just get, and it's some, the nice thing is that you have all these different flavor varieties as well. I'm going to put these up. And we have here African blue, which is another blue form.
African blue gets really big, and it has really pretty blue flowers.
Let me
and
hold on to that
it seems to be more cold hardy than the other ones. African and Thai, I've protected into late winter.
Okay.
By covering them when it's cold.
And there are a whole host of lemon scented and flavored herbs, and including in the basil family too. This little guy right here is the lemon Tabriz, which is a really delicious smelling plant. I was pinching the leaves on this and really imagine basil and lemon.
Yeah, that was a very lemony one.
Yeah, just terrific plants. And again, in containers or in the ground. Typically in the ground, these guys start to get pretty bushy, don't they?
Oh, and that's one thing that I would like to share with you, is they do get bushy and they bolt as soon as it gets warm. And you need to keep plucking the blossoms, but don't just head them. You should cut them way down here.
Oh, really? Okay.
Because if you head the blossoms, that encourages more blossoming.
Ah, I see.
So what you want to encourage is more leafing.
Right. So be a little dramatic in terms of the pruning.
Yeah, get down, below the second note or so.
Okay.
There.
Well, again, tons of different forms of basil, and you brought a pot here of holy basil, which is really a wonderful plant from India, I believe, and there's Thai basils, just a whole host of different things that people can play with in the garden. But I don't want to just focus on basils because you've brought a whole bunch of other things too. And this is a sweet marjoram. It's in the oregano family, actually, which I think some people would be surprised by. And these are also fairly easy plants to grow here, aren't they?
They are, and they're milder than oregano. They're very easy to grow. When I was in England a few years ago, we visited a ruined castle, and marjoram and oregano were still growing from the kitchen garden that they had all over the hills.
It doesn't surprise me at all.
And mint, it was
Centuries
great,
later, they just kind of become part of the landscape, right? And of course, there are all different uses for these for cooking, but just a delightful plant to have. And I want to bring this one down. This is one that you can find, and this is one of the most ornamental, I think, of the herbs. This is Mexican marigold, Mexican oregano. And this is one that often gets covered with just beautiful lavender flowers, a great plant for the garden. And this is one that has a real kind of
has a very robust flavor. And it's a robust plant.
Mm-hmm.
It blossoms, and the blossoms turn kind of brown. You have to, you can trim it frequently, and it keeps a nice form. If you don't, it tends to get a little leggy. But it has a nice presence in your landscape. I wouldn't put it in the garden. You know, it'd be too big. Well, for my garden.
Yeah,
but, you know.
I think mixing it into the ornamental landscape is exactly where you would use this plant. Because you're right, it does get kind of outsized for a lot of people when they have herb beds. They tend to be kind of small.
Yeah.
And this is one that will definitely get kind of large. Right next to you, we have a couple of thymes. And just talk about cultivation of the thymes briefly, if you would.
Well, thymes, they really don't like to have wet feet. They like to be in a sandy sort of, or granite, red granite is great for them. They're real great between paving stones. There's a couple of forms. There's one that gets bigger and bushier, and then low-growing ones. I have this one in my garden.
Right.
And I had the lemon thyme. I had a little bit more trouble with it, trying to put it in a pot.
Right.
But I was watering it too much, I think.
Well, there, you know, that gets back to that whole thing about good drainage. And, you know, we didn't even get to talk about half of the things that we have here with us, but there's lemongrass and different forms of mint and Mexican epazote. There's so many things that people can play with here. And real briefly, the Herb Society meets every month, right?
Every first Tuesday of every month.
Right.
From 9 to 12 at the Zilka Garden Center.
Right.
And we have great programs. We have the best refreshments any
club
has.
Anyway, well, we appreciate you so much being a part of the program today. Cindy, thanks for sharing your knowledge of these great summertime plants for Austin. And now it's time for Skip Richter.
Hello and welcome to Down to Earth. This week's question regards growing vegetables in the summer. Now in spring everybody's a gardener, and fall is really the best gardening season of the year. However, we can grow a lot of things in our gardens through the summer season. It's not as big of a palette as the other parts of the year, but no reason to give up on vegetable gardening. Okra is one of our most heat-resistant vegetables, and if you haven't tried okra, you ought to. Maybe you don't care for fried okra or you don't care for gumbo, but there are many ways of barbecuing actually okra with a little oil on it, and some other ways of fixing it that are really tasty, and you ought to give it a try in your garden. Southern peas do well here. Now they like a lighter soil than we have in most areas of central Texas. Our black clay is not something they're really fond of, but they'll grow in it if you provide a lot of composted organic matter or if you bring in a little bit of sandy soil to mix in with it. The black-eyed peas, crowder peas, and others do well. Sweet potatoes absolutely love the heat. We grow them as an ornamental, and we can also grow them in the vegetable garden. We have an insect pest, a weevil that bothers them that we have to deal with, but they will grow here quite well. Then there are several greens. Malabar, sometimes called Malabar spinach, grows very well in the heat. Amaranth does too. Amaranth is kin to what we call pigweed in the garden, and there are vegetable types and grain types. I'd encourage you to try the vegetable types of amaranth, the leafy types. They're quite tasty and easy to grow. Then there are a number of different ethnic vegetables from warm areas of the world, such as Southeast Asia, for example, and the Middle East that do quite well here. They're not as easy to find in the nurseries and garden centers, but you can order the seed online. Don't give up gardening just because it's summer. Make sure you mulch the area well, and then also provide adequate water to keep things going, and your vegetable garden will continue to produce for you. This week's featured plant is shrimp plant. Shrimp plant is one of those tough plants that just really does well on very little care. A minor amount of water because it really likes to grow in the shade. You can grow it in sun, but put it in a little bit of shade and it does well. In fact, if you put it in a lot of shade, it still does fairly well. It blooms with a unique little blossom on top. The standard rusty red type is the most common, but there's also a yellow type that you can plant. And shrimp plant is a perennial that just keeps coming back. If you get tired of looking at the leaves or how it's looking, you can shear it back even to the ground if you want, and it'll bounce right back and keep growing well for you. It's one we ought to use more often in our gardens. Out in the garden, it's time to prune any spring blooming plants that you haven't already pruned. Perhaps you have a ladybank's rose or an azalea plant or spirea or anything that blooms in the spring only. That's the things that we want to be pruning now so that they can regrow, set buds, and be ready for next year's spring bloom. In the vegetable garden, planting melons and cantaloupes, muskmelons can be done now. Winter squash takes a long time to produce. That would include the pumpkins, and so we want to go ahead and get those in. In the flower garden, lantana and all the various kinds of salvia do well through the heat. Celosia, the plume types I think are especially attractive, and they do well now. Portulaca or purslane. If you want cut flowers, zinnias and sunflowers can go in. And then those vines, a summer vine like morning glory does really well. Make sure and fertilize any plants that are in containers regularly to keep them going. For more plant tips or to contact the Extension office in your county, visit klru.org/CTG.
Thanks, Skip. Now let's check in with John Dromgoole for Backyard Basics.
Hello gardening friends, welcome to Backyard Basics. A lot of people are growing citrus these days, and they're finding them at the nurseries in containers, and it's pretty nice to have a citrus plant in your backyard. You get the fruit, of course, from limes and grapefruits and oranges and Persian limes and a whole list of other types of citrus out there. And they're somewhat easy to grow, but they have certain needs in order to do it. If you can't supply these needs, maybe you shouldn't grow citrus. One of the basic needs is protection from the winter cold. These guys will not take deep freezes. In 1983, almost all of the citrus in the state of Texas, all the way down to the valley, were frozen to death. So you're going to need to protect them. Many folks will plant them in the ground, and if you're going to plant it in the ground, you have to have a well-draining soil. They get a disease called foot rot. And if they get in a wet soil, then they're dead. They're not going to make it. And so, of course, you really need to develop a raised bed if your soil doesn't drain well. Probably a foot deep, nice and large as you can make it, and about a foot deep. You know, when you're planting them in that well-draining soil, one of the things that you should do at first is maybe make a little berm around it, like you see right here. This nice little berm will not last all that long, maybe a couple of months, and you can focus the water in there when you water it. At first, maybe 2 to 3 waterings a week, just the first week. And in the second week, you try to get it down to 1 or 2 waterings. You don't want to overwater your citrus. And then after that, you'll begin to taper off as the plant gets established. Now, they like to feed too. They like some nitrogen in their fertilizer program. You don't need to poke holes in the ground. It doesn't really work that way. You just broadcast it on top of the soil, and it will take it into the soil nicely. At first, you don't really need to feed them because they come with fertilizer. There's fertilizer in these containers, enough to keep them going for quite some time. As a matter of fact, if you plant them in spring, the first feeding might be in May. And if you do another one of nitrogen, it could be in September. And in reality, once they are well established, you would do it 3 times a year, once in February, possibly again in May, and then again in the fall. So those are very important. Another benefit that could be added would be the use of mycorrhiza. Mycorrhiza on trees and shrubs and any other plant is beneficial, and it's the same thing with the citrus. They really would benefit from this fungal organism that helps them gather nutrients from the area. When it gets to protecting them out in the cold, even though there are these special types of wraps that you could put on them and keep them a couple of degrees higher, it's really not enough. A nice mulch on the crown of it all the way up to where the graft is. If you can protect that little piece above the graft, in case it freezes back, you might get some new growth from right there. And like I said, container plants, you can see many people will buy several of them and put them in containers and maybe move them up against the wall out of that north wind. And finally, here's a good look at one. This is a grapefruit out in South Austin that has been there for many years, probably 10 years now. Look at the size of it. It's 2 stories tall. So it's made it through all of the freezes by being on that southwestern part of the house. It really does help it. And this one hasn't even really been covered except in the beginning when it hardens off. So this is a beautiful big plant. You may be able to do that in your yard too. And there are many varieties that you could pick from. Some of them are cold hardier than than others, and that would be the way to determine what you're going to plant. If you're going to put them out in an open area in the wintertime, you have to protect them. That would be essential. And but the southeastern part of the house would be a very good part. So a feeding schedule of nitrogen, that's the only real fertilizer that you'd put on there, would be key to their success. Promoting new growth on there is going to promote some of those beautiful flowers that they have and a nice big crop of citrus. For Backyard Basics, I'm John Dromgoole. I'll see you next time.
For more tips, online video, and our blog, visit klru.org/ctg. Next week, see how to patioscape with succulents. Until then, I'll see you in the garden. Visit klru.org/ctg to learn more about today's program, upcoming events, and to sign up for our electronic newsletter. Check out John's how-to tips and visit Trish's Corner for ideas inside and out. Get growing at klru.org/ctg.